Welcome back, everybody, to this, our third panel, which is Abject, Objects, Film, Television and Analogue 1. And chairing the panel for us is Dr. Stella Gaynor. I'm going to hand over to Stella to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Laura. It's my great pleasure to announce our first speaker for this panel. We've got Brontë Schiltz. I think I said that correctly, with her paper, I Don't Want to Watch the Ending, Televisual Gothic Inside Number 9. Brontë is a PhD candidate at Manchester Metropolitan University. Her work has appeared in the SFRA Review, the Sybil, Fantastica Journal, Atonum Journal, SIC Journal and Revenant Journal, as well as Vision, Contestation and Deception, Interrogating Gender and the Supernatural in Victorian Shorter Fiction. Penny Dreadfuls and the Gothic, Investigations of Pernicious Tales of Terror, the Gothic, Myriad Manifestations, a study of the various forms of the Gothic, and Nigel Neal Horror. She has also spoken on podcasts Victorian Legacies, the Ghost Story Book Club and Bergcast, and given 2 lectures with Romancing the Gothic. There's a lot happening there. So if you want to share your screen, get cracking, and I will leave you to it.
Thanks very much, Stella. Okay. So as Stella said, I'm going to be presenting on Inside Number 9 and my theorization of the televisual Gothic. So horror and audiovisual technology share an extensive history. A dictionary published in 1696 described the then cutting-edge device, the magic lantern, as a small optical machine that shows by a gloomy light upon a white wall spectres and monsters so hideous that he who knows not the secret believes it to be performed by a magic art. And the following century, early projection apparatus to aid a Fusicon, which you can see here, prompted William Beckford to write his extravagant Orientalist and Gothic fantasy Vathek. And these technologies also significantly altered cultural conceptions of the otherworldly. For instance, Susan Owens explains that it was only in the late 18th century that ghost appearance began to reflect their insubstantial qualities, and that their acquisition of see-through properties seems to have developed concurrently with developments in optical entertainments and light shows that transformed public entertainment at that time. It's little wonder then that scholars like Nora Ledwan have argued that television would seem to be the ideal medium for Gothic inquiry. It is, after all, a mysterious box simultaneously inhabited by spirit images of ourselves and inhabiting our living rooms. So in 2006, Helen Wheatley published the first extensive study of Gothic horror on the small screen, Gothic television, which she defined as a domestic form of a domestic genre which is deeply concerned with the domestic, writing stories of unspeakable family secrets and homely trauma large across the television screen. But as Geoffrey Sconce has noted, the 20th century also saw a proliferation of self-reflexive meditations on the viewer's potentially dangerous relationship to technology and the phantom world it evoked. And I denote these metafictional texts as televisual Gothic. So to borrow some language from James Rendell, who's also presenting today, TV horror about TV horror. So in this paper, I'm going to be reading Risha Smith and Steve Pemberton's horror anthology series Inside Number 9 through this lens, focusing specifically on 2016 episode The Devil of Christmas and the DVD commentary for 2015 episode Seance Time. So, The Devil of Christmas is presented as a piece of ropey 70s television. It follows a family holidaying in an Austrian ski lodge. Julian, his mother Celia, his young son Toby, and his pregnant second wife Kathy, after the lodge's caretaker Klaus tells them the legend of Krampus. The narrator is then interrupted by voiceover from diegetic director Dennis Fulcher and an interviewer. This voiceover draws attention to errors and shortcomings in the production, such as a continuity error in the placement of a painting, at which point the tape is rewound at Fulcher's request. But another error is visible before this point. A boom dips into frame approximately 2 minutes into the episode. This, actual director Graham Harper notes, was unforced. He explains that Stephen Rees insisted everything should be as natural as possible. Don't try to create booms dropping in. They did quite naturally, and the set wobbled. You didn't have to force things, you just let them happen. This, he says, was the natural result of an absolutely authentic recreation of 1970s production. The episode was shot in just 2 days, with 3 cameras that were very old and likely to go wrong. as in fact one did. That the limitations of the medium would be noticeable to the modern eye was the writer's intent. We didn't want to overplay the mistakes, Pemberton said, but we didn't want people to miss them either. The audience is thereby encouraged to actively engage with their television set, pausing and rewinds to check or, if viewing with others, draw attention to blips. Notably, the technology that facilitates this kind of participation was in development during the 1970s. In 1971, JVC began work on the VHS, which, when it was released on the market 6 years later, became the dominant video format until the release of the DVD in 1996. So as Alexandra Heller-Nicholas argues, video technology has meant that we can control time itself, affording the viewer the ability to rewind and replay favoured moments. This holds obvious capacity to generate horror, enabling a sadistic form of voyeurism. But moreover, video also allowed filmmakers to produce works that did not meet the standards set by censors. Rather than relying on cinema runs or television broadcasts, they could distribute films directly to audiences via cassette without official approval. This led to the production of video nasties and, according to legend, far worse. At the end of The Devil of Christmas, the diegetic episode is revealed to be a snuff film, when Penny, the unsuspecting actress playing Kathy, is brutally murdered. Always a strange moment when you see them realise what's going on, Fulcher says. You see there's no acting here, that's genuine fear. I don't think I want to watch the ending. He shows no remorse for his involvement, merely adding, well, that's it. Can't believe it surfaced again after all these years. In its defence, it is one of the better ones. The voiceover is thus revealed to be not a director's commentary, but a police interview. But what is most horrific about this revelation is not Penny's death, which is not shown, but the response from Fulcher, whose use of the word always implies that this was not his only snuff picture. And moreover, the policeman, who frequently responds with interest and amusement to Fulcher's anecdotes and observations, as of course do we. Derek Johnston discusses the frequently historical setting of Christmas horror television in connection with the common view of the past as a less rational place, where strange things were more likely to happen. Which Smith and Pemberton trade on here. Everything about the episode evokes the 1970s. But crucially, fact-checking site Snopes assures readers that not so much as one snuff film has been found. Time and again, what is originally decried as a film of a murder turns out, upon further investigation, to be a fake. But in recent years, evidence has emerged of numerous deaths resulting from a very different kind of media. In 2019, an investigation found that 38 people had taken their lives after appearing on reality television. The issue drew public attention that year when the Jeremy Kyle show was axed following the suicide of participant Steve Diamond. Channel 4's dispatches subsequently reported that 5 other suicide attempts have been linked to the programme, and found that 2 contestants from ITV's Love Island had also taken their own lives. But these deaths in fact date back to 2005, the year the Jeremy Kyle show was first broadcast. And chillingly, an anonymous camera operator who came forth following Diamond's death describes the programme in distinctly gothic terms, comparing the set to a meat processing plant, and remarking that the horrors that were being committed in the bowels of that building can never be scrubbed from those walls, ever. So in using the language of low-budget 1970s broadcasting to encourage both active engagement and amusement, Smith and Pemberton create the comforting sense of a bygone age noted by Johnston, but also recreate the experience of viewing television like the Jeremy Kyle show that encourages mockery with devastating effects. So the ethics of television production and consumption is a recurrent theme in Inside Number 9, also explored in 2015's Seance Time. The episode follows the production team behind a prank show, Scaredy Cam, which was previously cancelled, we're told, after a little boy wet himself during a live broadcast. Obsessively preoccupied with his reputation, its host, Terry, appears to regret this only insofar as it damaged his career. This is underscored when he responds to a new participant, Pete, accidentally killing an actor during filming merely with anxiety for his professional standing. He's confronted with the fatality of his callousness, however, when the actor's corpse is possessed by the spirit of the little boy, who, unbeknownst to him, drowned himself to escape the humiliation of having his terror broadcast to the nation. And here the act of ghost seeing carries significant implications regarding the morality of spectatorship. Dale Townsend posits that Shakespeare provided early writers of Gothic with precedents for two distinct modes for ghost seeing, the one tragically figured in Hamlet and the other in Macbeth. In the latter, Shakespeare established connections between ghost seeing and guilt. Only Macbeth can see Banquo's ghost because he is responsible for his murder. It is notable then that in Seance Time, the only character to see the spirit is Terry, but there is also a non-diegetic voyeur in the form of the audience. So in his work on what he terms glitch Gothic, Marc Olivier argues that the glitch must first register with a human subject as error before it can be called a glitch. In short, horror precedes the glitch. That is, technological function is inherently neutral, but classified as right or wrong by the viewer, and it is this perception of wrongness that generates horror. In the final moments of the episode, the audience are positioned in front of the backstage monitor, which they have previously seen glitching. It momentarily shows Terry turning towards the camera, before this view is obscured by the spirit, whose enraged expression is directed solely towards the viewer. If Terry is reprehensible for his selfish indifference towards the suffering of others, this suggests, then so are we for seeking such suffering out for voyeuristic pleasure. Shearsmith and Pemberton again emphasised the horrific potential of the rewind function of video technology when Terry replays the footage of the actor's death on the monitor, muttering, "What a shame, it was fucking funny." The disruption caused by the glitch and the jarring effect it has on viewers, both diegetic, Terry and the crew, and non-diegetic, the audience, forces the audience to confront the fact that the normalised act of observing suffering and death is in fact a conscious choice that we perhaps only recognise when our capacity to do so is disrupted, an increasingly rare event in the age of digital streaming. The audiences of both Scaredy-Cam and Seance Time are thus implicated in a Macbethian coupling of ghosts and moral culpability, posing difficult questions regarding the morality of both producing and consuming media that relies on exploitation and violence. So in 2022, director Peter Strickland described his short film Black Narcissus, a tragic love story, as the first example of mock DVD commentary, describing the form as an antiquated supplement to home entertainment with the dominance of streaming. But in fact, the form dates back to Rob Brydon's comedy Director's Commentary in 2004. But as well as utilising the form as the basis of the misdirection in The Devil of Christmas, Shearsmith and Pemberton also produced actual DVD commentary for many episodes. And in the DVD commentary for Seance Time, Shearsmith becomes increasingly irate with Pemberton, and the commentary culminates with Pemberton ostensibly accidentally killing him in a moment of frustration. This builds on the previous episode's commentary, in which both creators play versions of themselves, Pemberton calm and generous towards fans, and Shearsmith irritable and critical, leading towards an argument on the Seance Time commentary about audience reception. Notably then, Inside Number 9 features the first two instances of mock commentary horror, both centering the reception of television programming via physical media. Inside Number 9 embraces technological advance. Series 5 to 7, for instance, were accompanied not by DVD commentaries, but a podcast on BBC Sounds. But Shearsmith and Pemberton also repeatedly remind viewers of the physicality of television, with 2018's Deadline and 2023's 3x3 relying on live viewership, though also encouraging, in the case of Deadline, Twitter engagement, for their full impact, and emphasising the complex morality of their medium's production and reception. After all, dead media in horror is never truly dead. As Derrida famously remarked of ghosts, it remains always to come and to come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brontë. All right, I'm gonna go and watch all of Inside Number 9 again. Whenever anybody talks about it, and insist on seeing them all again. So what we'll do then is we will move straight on to Rich Scott, who I know is here. So Rich Scott with his paper, The Old Ways, the Resurgence of Analogue Filmmaking Practice Amongst Contemporary Film Folk. Now, Rich Scott is a lecturer in film and broadcasting at Ayrshire College in Scotland. Currently, he's pursuing his MA in film and television at Falmouth University, with a research focus on otherly pastoralism, landscape and analogue film practice. His most recent publication is the video essay titled You're Making Me Mangry, nice, an examination of masculinity in crisis within the Incredible Hulk television series. He resides in the historic village of Alloway with his fiancée, dog and cat. If the dog and cat want to come on screen, that's all good. Right, I'll hand it over to you. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're all well today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work that I'm doing at Falmouth at the moment, which is essentially researching the coincidence of the folk horror revival and the analog resurgence. So I'm just going to share my screen now, hopefully. Hopefully that should be visible to everyone. Okay, so in the following paper, which represents my preliminary findings on a large body of work exploring the intersect between folk horror and analog film, I will explore recent examples from the independent filmmakers utilising motion picture film and practices both within an aesthetic and storytelling capacity. The exploration is motivated by the wish to draw correlations between two contemporaneous phenomena, namely that of the folk horror revival, the renewed interest in folk horror and the creation of new works within the genre, and the analog resurgence, a term commonly used to refer to renewed interest in and revival of various analog technologies, but used here within exclusively with relation to analog film technologies. Central to this exploration are the concepts and concerns of authenticity, nostalgia, and the supernatural, all of which are prominent components of the folk horror genre. Authenticity often lies at the heart of the cultural clash between the modern and the ancient, as is exemplified by Penda in Penda's Fen, where Stephen Franklin is compelled to grapple with two competing ideas of the real England. Sorry, I'm just going to move this screen a wee bit. Nostalgia, a nuanced theme within folk horror, complicates the narrative, compels viewers to inhabit a liminal space in which the rural and the pastoral allure is simultaneous with a menacing undercurrent or dark secret, as is evident in The Wicker Man, where the tranquil and simplistic Isle of Summer Isle has an appealing nature and a foreboding one. The supernatural or ancient magic, often manifested through religious rites, sacred spaces, animistic practitioners, and or as is demonstrated in Whistle and I'll Come to You, a haunted artifact. Yet this paper also takes the perspective that these same concerns, authenticity, nostalgia, and the supernatural, constitute preoccupations for contemporary filmmakers who opt to engage with motion picture film, as well as what we might call the folk horror or weird fandom. This analysis will focus on 4 distinct films crafted by individual filmmakers: Dean Puckett's 2018 11-minute short film, The Sermon; Craig Williams' Welsh language 20-minute short film, The Worm of Welsh Bambaras; and Austin Jennings' feature film 8 Eyes, and the Cornish writer-director Mark Jenkins' feature film Ennis Men. So set predominantly within the isolated parish nestled within English countryside, Dean Puckett's The Sermon sees a young woman turn against her father, a hate preacher, and his congregation after they publicly humiliate her secret lover, an older woman from the community, whom, sorry, I'm having problems with my screen here, whom they tied to a wooden structure and pelt with fruits and insults as punishment for being gay. The younger woman also participates in the primitive ritual due to her fear of the mob. The influence of The Wicker Man and Blood on Satan's Claw is readily apparent in the feature. However, it's arguable that the emphasis on homosexuality with a rural small-town community and the overbearing presence of a Christian orthodoxy align it more closely with the aforementioned Penda's Fen. In both films, the narrative begins with the protagonist delivering an off-screen monologue addressed to England, over which a montage of English countryside plays. Both introduce their protagonist gazing out of a window, as if in contemplation of the land and its symbolic significance within the realms of identity, politics, and the mythical. Furthermore, both films climax with a mythological force, potentially imagined, aiding the protagonist in overthrowing their oppressors. Despite its clear lineage to foundational horror, The Sermon is decidedly contemporary. In a 2020 talk at Falmouth University, Dean Puckett noted that the short was written in the haze of exasperation he experienced after Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, victories he attributed to insular communities looking to the past for answers. This interjection of the modern is noticeable within the film, as the religion, which now finds itself cast as the ancient and outdated, is some form of Christianity. Indeed, the church congregation has got more in common with Sergeant Howie's parish from the beginning of The Wicker Man than it does with the inhabitants of Summerisle. During the aforementioned talk, Puckett further expounded that his selection of the 35mm film format was motivated by an aspiration to infuse the work with a sense of authenticity. I was clear I wanted to shoot the film on 35mm because all those films I'm referencing were shot on 35mm, and I wanted to be almost like you could play it alongside them and it would fit. The depiction of the analog cine camera as a vessel through which authenticity can be attained is a relatively recent occurrence. Writing in her 2018 essay, The Ambivalence of Authenticity, Erica Balsam takes the opportunity to remind us that film is of the first machine age. It is forever tied to the destruction of nature, colonial projects, and domination of life proper to industrial modernity. Indeed, the emergence of film was one of the prompting factors which led German scholar Walter Benjamin to write a seminal essay, The Work of Art in the Machine Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Yet we can attribute that same event within the first machine age to the impulses which we now see in analog film rescued from the dustbin. As Balsam further states, in the late 19th century, authenticity became a major preoccupation precisely because it was deemed to be under threat. Similarly, it has also recently emerged as a force in contemporary culture where it is perceived as a way of escaping the monotony, automation, and even deceptiveness of the digital experience. While it is worth drawing a distinction between Puckett's wish to attain authentic visual and aesthetic style, rather than some quest for aura, it is notable that in achieving the latter, he may also have achieved the former. When discussing his experience with the sermon at film festivals, he noted that the use of 35mm had a noticeable effect on attendees. Speaking of the effect, he said it elevated it in terms of the way people viewed it at film festivals. It gave it something extra and made it a bit more special, so that people paid more attention to it. But that took a lot of effort and it took a lot of planning, and it was about having to be very meticulous about the shots. It is perhaps not unreasonable to assume that the audience who might attend an independent film festival with a basic understanding of the filmmaking process, the increased risk and effort required in capturing a story on 35mm is part of what produces the demarcation of the work as special or indeed authentic. While recent news that Kodak's new Super 8 filmmeter camera would be a prohibitively priced $5,495, would lend credence to the accusation of what Andrew Porter termed conspicuous authenticity applied to goods status symbols, which are attributed their value based on people's lack of access to them. This ignores the obvious threat to livelihood. However, this ignores the obvious threat to livelihood and working conditions posed by the Third Industrial Revolution. Examining the trends observed in recent years, including market saturation, unfair business models, heightened expectations for both quantity and quality of output, with compressed development compressed development timelines, one can contemplate a reframing of those who embrace analog methods as what Schiltz coined neo-Luddites. It is not my intention to propose an imminent uprising where a legion of overworked and underpaid filmmakers brandishing film production apparatus as weapons is nearby, nor is it to draw a direct parallel between the conditions of contemporary content creators and those of 19th century child laborers. Instead, it emphasizes the significant human capital demand in both contexts, ferociously consumed with little consideration for the well-being or long-standing sustainability. At this juncture, a potential nexus between folk horror genre and the analog filmmaking community becomes discernible, completing a thematic circuit. This convergence is markedly juxtaposed of monolithic cultures against smaller artisanal cultural expressions. In the same talk, as referenced before, Puckett was keen to distance himself and the sermon from what he terms film nerd nostalgia for the photo film. This is intriguing given that the undeniable part eerie nostalgia has played in the revival of folk horror, linked at least within the UK with what Bob Fisher termed the haunted generation, the generation which grew up consuming rough around the edges pop culture products of the 1970s and 80s. The Worm of Bullocks Barras is a Welsh language 20-minute short film shot on Super 16. When I spoke to Julian Allen, the film's producer, he acknowledged that writer and director Craig Williams was inspired by nostalgia for the period, but it was not a deciding factor to shoot the film. but instead the subject matter. It was not a deciding factor in shooting the film, but instead the subject matter. This particular story, he said, and what we were going to need for it had to be shot on film. The narrative of Welsh Ben Barras is such that it is shorn of the visual iconography and trappings of the traditional folk horror. There are no maples, breezy dresses, or flower crowns. Indeed, within the story world, only the setting, Ruth in Wales, serves to offer any sort of visual signpost to the narrative of the story unfolding. Even the protagonists, who are largely silent about some unspoken business at hand, feel more in keeping with that of a British crime film than a traditional folk horror. In this regard, the iconography, by technical aspects of the production, the film reveals little about its genre until in this regard, the iconography is provided by the technical aspects of the production. The film reveals little about its genre until its closing moments, when only the title, which references the worm, a Welsh for dragon, and the Hammer Studios inspired title card crafted by Richard Wells, provide overt indicators. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Herein, the significance of employing 16mm film, which has one of the distinctive markers akin to the generation's ingrained and essential symbols, such as the flower crown or the imagined of a wild-eyed hare, as evident illustration of the integration of cinefilm and the ephemera of the folk horror genre observed in the recent. Is an evident illustration of the integration of cinefilm within the folk horror genre is observed in the Vinegar Syndrome production Eight Eyes from 2023, directed by Austin Jennings, filmed on location in Serbia. This production is about a mysterious local figure who disrupts a couple's vacation in former Yugoslavia, intertwining them further in the realm of psychic rituals. Intriguingly, within Eight Eyes, the folk horror appears to emanate not from the distant past, but rather the 1970s itself, as it draws heavily from the cults, occults, and human potential projects which found such prominence in the decade. Shot on Super 16mm, Eight Eyes further entwines the cine camera with folk genre by elevating it to an on-screen presence, as the male protagonist, Gav, documents the couple's holiday on the camera, shots from which are interspliced into the film. Through this integration of the cine camera and storytelling device, Eight Eyes not only pays homage to the historical association between cinefilm and folk horror, but also elevates the cine camera to status of iconographic paraphernalia of the genre. Interestingly, the experiences reported by Fisher's haunted generation, this sense of intermingling nostalgia and anxiety, is not uncommon. Psychologist Eugene Saborsky, formerly of the University of Lancaster, describes in his 2018 book, Science and Magic in the Modern World, describes looking at the paintings of Cicero and Marguerite, which he referred to as ambassadors of an alien world. These paintings immerse one in that world, which one resembles our everyday world, and in another sense is fundamentally different from it. Saborsky attributes this otherworldly power held within the artworks as a form of existent magical thinking, in which concepts of magic which have been suppressed from our conscious dwell within the subconscious and are attributed to artworks and psychotherapy, amongst other things. Drawing on Hollis Frampton's notion that no activity can become an art until its proper epoch has ended and it is dwindled as an aid of survival into total adolescence, Erica Holsons notes that analog camera has undergone a transformation from the industrial to the artisanal. By weaving together these concepts, one can post that a diminishing functionality of the camera as a visual storytelling instrument from a large-scale industrial productions, transforming it into what is colloquially termed a dead media, has concurrently ushered in its resurgence as an artisanal tool. The shift not only marks as a functional transition, but also imbues the film camera with psychological properties akin to those of magic. From the inception of cinema, an inherent and symbolic relationship has existed between the magical and the cinematic realms. This antecedent to cinema, the Magic Lantern served as a precursor to the cinematic experience and has frequently employed the stage phantasmagoria, captivating audiences with supernatural spectacles. Pioneering filmmakers, notably exemplified by George Méliès, transcended conventional roles by embodying both filmmakers and practitioners of by being both a filmmaker and a practitioner of magic. Nevertheless, it is arguable that over the passage of the intertwining years, that the magic inherent in cinematic experience has waned, while acknowledging that the comprehensive exploration of this assertion extends beyond the scope of this presentation. A succinct summary may encompass several factors. These include the excessive reliance on computer-generated effects for visual spectacle, heightened awareness among audiences regarding the intricacies of the film production process, adherences to formalistic storytelling conventions, and the widespread availability of cost-effective digital film equipment. It is in this context that the work of Mark Jenkin becomes salient. The Cornish-born writer-director of a BAFTA-winning Bait and the experimental Ennis Men is pivotal within the discussion of folk horror and analogue, because it is the proposition of this paper that this film's not a shot. Sorry, this film's shot on a hand. Sorry, his film shot on hand-cranked Bolex H16 doesn't just contain the supernatural elements akin with folk magic, but as of Subtlety's definition, are folk magic. Jenkins' Ennis Men, in which a wildlife volunteer living on an island of the Cornish coast documenting her observations of a wildflower, contain the iconography of the folk horror genre, such as standing stones, ghostly apparitions, and period costuming. Yet is the artisanal approach combined with the utilization of filmmaking processes for which the knowledge is slipping or has slipped from the popular zeitgeist, which imbues his work with their esoteric power. Unlike the blockbuster picture film, which is picked over by teams of professionals rendering an image so clean that it is comparable with the digital, the photochemical process and handicraft aspects of Jenkins' work are the spectacle, the invisible but detectable presence of a hand when zooming or pulling focus, the dubbed audio, the intentional underexposure of film to heighten its distressed appearance, all serve to heighten the sense of temporal slippage, the awareness of the production, and our sense of the invisible being made visible. In conclusion, this paper provides preliminary insights into the intersect of folk horror and analogue film, focusing on the recent works of independent filmmakers who embrace motion picture film technologies. The exploration is driven by a concurrent phenomena of folk horror revival and the analogue resurgence, investigating connections with authenticity, nostalgia, and supernatural integral components of both folk horror and 16mm. And it's indie film. The search for authenticity is genuine, but leads to larger questions about the nature and value of the supposedly authentic item, who the consumer may be, and why it appeals to them. Nostalgia, a prevalent theme in folk horror, manifests differently in each film, contributing to their distinctiveness. Art, as understood by Eugene Subotsky as a form of magic, requires greater investigation, but hints at a potential means by which we can explain the appeal of cine film beyond the simple classification of fetishism. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Rich. Wow, there was loads there. Loads and loads. As you were speaking, I've written down a big list of all those films, so I've got a watch list. Thank you very much. Our final paper for this panel is by our very own Dr. Shellie McMurdo, and the paper is titled "Love Letters in Blood: The Renaissance of Special Effects."
Whichever one you fancy today.
Whichever one you fancy. Renaissance. So, Dr. Shellie McMurdo is a lecturer in film and television at the University of Hertfordshire. She's one of the co-founders, co-conveners of the BAFTSS Horror Studies Special Interest Group, hence why we're all here, co-editor of the Hidden Horror Histories book series from Liverpool University Press, and the author of Blood on the Lens, Trauma and Anxiety in American Found Footage Cinema from Edinburgh Uni Press. And, let's not forget, Devil's Advocate. She's also published work on various other aspects of horror screen media, such as post-peak torture horror, the true crime fandom, and Blumhouse Productions. She's currently working on a research project with Dr. Laura Mee on analogue formats in contemporary horror, and embarking on a solo project around practical effects in the horror genre.
So today I'm going to be talking about practical effects, and in particular, how the use of practical effects in certain contemporary horror films has led to these more recent texts being categorised as love letters to the genre as it stood in the 1980s. So it's worth saying that practical effects and gore effects can, of course, be two completely different things. So I wanted to flag up that for the purposes of today, I'm very much centering around gore effects. And I think that also acts as a content warning of sorts for my upcoming slides, which are quite gory. So to start, I just wanted to briefly discuss 1980s horror and gore's relationship to it. That's the first one of those gory slides, see, I told you. James Kendrick has proposed that gore arguably became the central organising principle of horror films in the 1980s. And the specific way that gore was represented in the genre at this time, often through the creations of people such as Chris Wallace, Stan Winston, Greg Nicotero, Tom Savini, and other practical effects artists, is central to this paper, as is the specific kind of gore effects that 1980s horror was known for, and what the more recent films I'm going to be talking about are love letters to. So what I mean here is these kind of creations that are made out of foam latex, or ones that use puppetry or prosthetics, or that utilise men in monster suits. And most importantly, what I mean is effects that are practical and produced in camera, not in post-production and not on a computer. So the best example of the kind of effects I mean, I think, it would be 1982's The Thing. So the practical creature effects of The Thing, which were created by Rob Bottin and his team, are still, some 40 years later, held up as the golden standard in terms of practical horror effects. And I think this is why, perhaps, or at least is one of the reasons that 2011 CGI-heavy The Thing prequel didn't do very well with audiences. So broadly speaking, people were asking, why would you make a prequel to a film that is so well known for its practical effects and not use practical effects? And this negative response to the film grew when it was discovered that the film had actually initially used practical effects. And these have been created by Tom Woodruff Jr.'s Amalgamated Dynamic Studio. So Tom Woodruff Jr. is the person responsible for the practical effects in Pumpkinhead and some other key 1980s horror films. So it was like, not only does the finished product not forefront practical effects, but you also had a guy on board who knew how to do these kinds of effects really, really well, and you still didn't use them. Because despite Woodruff Jr.'s involvement, the finished 2011 film had digital effects overlaid onto his practical effects, to the point where they looked like they had been created purely through computer-generated imagery. And this was reported to be due to studio concern that practical effects would make the film appear dated. So this was a sentiment that was also underlined in director Matthijs van Heijningen Jr.'s comments that they didn't hold up. It looked a bit like a 1980s movie, actually. So evidently for The Thing 2011, this was a comparison to be avoided. But in more recent films, such as the Terrifier and Hatchet series, and my case study for today, The Void, practical effects-driven gore is something to be championed rather than avoided. So these films are not only recalling the 1980s heyday of practical horror effects, but I would argue making an appeal to a specific and specialised subset of horror fans for whom gore is a key part of the genre's appeal. And in emphatically relying on impractical effects, I present these films as a site where the tension between the analogue and the digital is centralised. And this ties to Ernest Matisse's argument that horror film culture often seemingly antagonises digital effects, which is something that we can see play out in the reception of certain CGI-heavy horror releases over the past few decades. So Stacey Abbott, for example, noted that the critical reception to The Haunting in 1999 was characterised by attention being drawn to what one reviewer calls the noxious effects of the digital age. Comments such as these suggest, Abbott proposes, that the presence and ensuing spectacle of computer-generated effects was seen to diffuse the horror appeal and sacrifice the genre's intensity and integrity. There is something then about digital effects and the horror genre that doesn't quite seem to mix. And I think key to this is that idea of integrity, or to use another word, of authenticity. So The Haunting is just one example of a horror film that was perhaps seen as a sanitized version of the horror genre in the 1990s. And around this time, Mark Yankovic discussed a perceived difference between what he terms as real horror and mainstream commercial horror. So Yankovic argues that such hierarchies were and are created to produce a clear sense of distinction between that which is defined as the authentic and subcultural and that which is presented as the inauthentic mass cultural other. And I think it's important to remember here that horror has been historically a divisive genre. It is, for example, traditionally ignored or marginalised within mainstream film culture. And as Henry Benshoff notes, it is somewhat ghettoised in popular culture as a critic-proof, low-class, low-budget exploitation genre aimed at thrill-seeking teenagers. And this impression of horror fans as primarily teenagers, or of the genre as juvenile in some way, has stuck around in the popular imagination, as well as the idea that horror fans are deviant, moronic, sick or stupid, or sick and stupid. And this perception of horror fans, particularly in the US, may have been influenced by the emergence and popularity of Fangoria magazine, which, by focusing on the gore and grish of the horror genre through glossy, full-colour features on special effects creators and creations, actually actively set itself in opposition to what could be considered mainstream good taste. However, as I've argued elsewhere, products like Fangoria have actually been central in assisting horror fans in developing and canonising their own paracinematic good tastes. So going back to Yankovic, he notes that many horror fans privilege as real and authentic those films of violent excess. And I think echoes of his argument can be found in David Church's proposal that for some fans, a large part of horror's subcultural appeal may reside in graphic gore and abject or extreme imagery. So I'd like to propose then that the presence of gore, or moreover practical effects-driven gore in these more recent films such as Terrifier and Hatchet, or the example here, which is 2013's remake of The Evil Dead, is, for a subset of fans, an indicator of a more authentic kind of horror. And within this discourse, I propose practical effects-produced gore is used as a tool for aesthetic discrimination and an expression of alignment. After all, it makes sense that if gore is often used as an example of how juvenile horror films are, and as a tool to other its fans, then conversely, that very mark of difference can be used as an object of appreciation. So to further explore this for the remainder of the paper, I'm going to focus on a particular case study, which is 2016's The Void. So The Void was described in reviews as a love letter to the 1980s, and a term that was highlighted, whether in a positive or a negative sense, was its status as a throwback. In particular, its use and forefronting of practical effects was cited as key to that term, as key to its status as a throwback. So as you may have expected, a lot of the more glowing reviews of The Void can be found in more specialised outlets such as Dread Central and Bloody Disgusting. In more mainstream outlets, the film, and many films like it, are dismissed. So there's one of those kind of dismissals up the top of the screen there. Dismissed as the kind of film you might get if if you gave a 15-year-old horror fan access to a strobe light, some white bed sheets, and a job lot of exploding prosthetic heads. So again, there's that sense that these films are juvenile, they're for teenagers. But as a comment from a reader underneath this very review astutely notes, the reviewer was not the intended audience for The Void. So for the intended viewer, the outsider status of gore-driven horror and the presence of effects that are perceived to be a kickback to the more adolescent type of horror film culture of the 1980s mean that The Void can be positioned as a more authentic kind of horror. So there is then a sense in the critical reception of The Void that the use of practical effects is a return to authenticity, a step that reasserts horror's outsider status. And there's a recurrent insistence that these films are for a particular discerning kind of viewer. So, for example, suggestions that unlike recent festival darlings as The Babadook or The Witch, The Void's appeal might not extend far beyond its base. Or that it's a film strictly for the hardcore horror fan base. So, not for the general horror fan base, but only the most hardcore or the most authentic. Or interestingly, given that I was talking about Fangoria just a second ago, that the film has the throwback aesthetic of a bygone era, beloved by many former Fangoria subscribers for whom big gory fistfuls of chunky crimson is king. And I think what's significant there is it notes a former Fangoria subscriber, because this is something that you grow out of, right? So again, that connection to being a teenager or being juvenile. And it's worth mentioning that whereas the film itself, The Void, was funded through traditional channels, there was an Indiegogo campaign launched by the creators purely to fund the practical effects, through which they raised over $82,000. And this campaign is interesting to me and my research because of the way it explicitly puts out this argument that practical effects are the way that horror should be done, and the suggestion that only true or authentic fans of the genre can really appreciate that. And another common theme in reviews of The Void are lines drawn between the analog and the digital. So, for example, comments that the blood-drenched mayhem has an immediate you are there feel that computer-made effects can't match. Or that the effects are excellent because they are created from latex and corn syrup as opposed to ones and zeros. So the battle lines between the analog and the digital are clearly drawn here then. And The Void may well be a key standard bearer in this perceived war, with its snapping, stomach-bursting, brain-splattering effects that urge CGI to fuck right off. Even in more negative reviews, the artistry of the film's special effects is often complimented. So one notes, for example, that although, in their opinion, and I think they're wrong, The Void is poorly paced and thinly plotted, that it contains effects that are refreshingly tactile. And this tactileness is another element I feel is central in any discussion around practical effects. So just as VHS boxes take up space on a shelf, practical effects occupy a physical space on screen and on set. And as Kartik Nair explains, this overt display and use of tactile effects allows filmmakers to exploit a nostalgic and naive ontologic of theirness in the age of digital simulation. So, the question remains as to why these kinds of effects have become suddenly so visible again in the horror genre. And a very, very straightforward explanation is simple nostalgia. So David Church explains that expressions of nostalgia are common at times of upheaval or change in media culture, and that a retreat to and nostalgia for older forms and formats may occur because as genre fans, we spend time gaining subcultural capital surrounding the genre, only to eventually find ourselves distanced in age and subcultural competence from the audience currently being catered to. So for some of us, perhaps, this particular kind of gore effects can be a significant part of our identity as horror fans. Our subcultural capital that we might have, our knowledge about these effects and the people that created them, can function to tie us and our individual experience of the genre to a certain time, place, and type of horror. And this is in particular something that the creators of these films do. They will often wear t-shirts with specific films known for practical effects on them, or specific companies that brought out a lot of horror films in the 1980s as well. Another explanation is that this is just part of the cyclic nature of the horror genre, where new lines between the authentic and the inauthentic are being drawn. And if that's the case, then maybe it's a movement like post-horror, which is, as David Church argues, privileging visual restraint over exaggerated displays of spectacularly opened bodies, that these films are in opposition against. And another possible explanation is that the renaissance of practical effects can be tied to the concurrent rise in collector cultures around VHS and vinyl in our current cultural moment, and that this speaks to a desire for the physical in an era of ephemerality. So whatever the answer, and even if this centralizing of practical effects is a temporary trend, which I very much hope it's not because it's very much my vibe, it would seem that in an age of crystal clear restorations and mainstream acclaim being reserved for those films that favour suggestion over spectacle, that there is actually still a desire for the scuzzy, the tactile, and the icky sticky. Thank you.
Thanks, Shellie.
Got there in the end.
Icky sticky indeed. All right, so if I can ask Brontë and Rich to flick their cameras back on, and when I can speak again, if people want to get typing away with their questions, so stick at the start of your question in the chat if you want me to ask it, or if you're happy to come on camera and ask yourself, and also stick the word question on it so I know that it is in fact a question. While we're waiting for folks to get typing, I have a question for Brontë, if it's okay, if your cough will allow, do run away and go and hack your guts up if you need to. So generally across all of those papers, they've got a clear thread of ideas around nostalgia and authenticity and things like that. And one of the things that I always think about with Inside Number 9 that I think Pemberton and Shearsmith lean on quite a lot is things around nostalgia. And when I watch some of the Inside Number 9 episodes, I tend to feel nostalgic for a time that I don't know what it is. Like it's this false past that they kind of invoke. And you mentioned, in the Devil of Christmas, when we're definitely in the 1970s, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about nostalgia inside Number 9, and what do you think they're nostalgic for?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've had some conversations with friends about certain episodes where we've said, when do you think it's set? Things that kind of feel contemporary, but then there are things about it that feel off. Like I was talking with a friend about Last Gasp, the one, people haven't seen it, it's about like a Make-A-Wish Foundation sort of thing, and the mother of a sick child gets her favorite singer to come, and he ends up dying, and they have this balloon containing his last breath. And that is ostensibly set in the modern day, but there's elements of it that feel slightly dated, like they don't feel quite connected in the way that we are now technologically. And it's quite interesting because I think they're quite preoccupied with technology, and especially with television technology, but you don't often see heavy use of phones or the internet and things like that in many episodes, which is quite interesting. And there's definitely a preoccupation with, I think, television past, and a media past more so than a real life past. So their most recent Christmas set episode, The Bones of St. Nicholas, seems to be set now, but it is very much drawing on the tradition of the Ghost Story for Christmas and like 70s adaptations of M.R. James. That's very much the vibe. And again, people seem to be kind of distanced from the modern world in certain ways, both in terms of their physical isolation. All episodes are kind of set in a confined space with not many people, but there's a moment where a phone rings, a landline phone, and one of the characters says, "What's that?" And the other character jokes. He responds as if she doesn't know what a phone is and makes a joke about them being newfangled machines. So I suppose at the heart, the past it's harking back to is a media past rather than a genuine past, the past of television history. And it's Derek Johnston, who I cite in the paper, talks about feel-bad heritage dramas, and like the kind of opposite of a period drama, when you're looking at the past as something that you're fascinated with, but also quite frightened by. And that's kind of the sense that I get from a lot of Inside Number 9. I think it's a complex nostalgia of, they're drawing on these cultural products that they obviously take a great interest in. But I also think there's quite a lot of wariness about those periods. They're also about our own period. So I think it's just wariness all the way through, possibly.
Yeah. I think the one that, you did mention it, it's called Deadline, the one where it's the live one where it all goes down. And that's when they do on that, they do talk about Twitter, don't they? That people complaining on Twitter about it, apparently. And didn't people complain on Twitter, really? Like people really thought it was bust?
Yeah, they did, and they genuinely sent tweets during it, which is really interesting. But there was some interesting research about how people engage with it in terms of Twitter and social media, which is that before and after episodes there'll be a flurry of activity on Twitter, but actually during the episodes, with the exception of Deadline, there actually isn't that much Twitter activity, which is quite uncommon for programming now. So people do seem to engage with it in kind of a historic viewership model, in terms of people do seem to sit quietly and watch it without going on their phones and then go on afterwards, that's a whole other paper maybe, but it's an interesting interesting thing.
All right then, so I'm going to go over to the questions. I'll just go through them in the order that they've come in with. So Brontë, back to you. I'm afraid I'm sure your throat can handle it. Could you say more about the ways you see aspects of the Gothic connected to wider mythologies of snuff? This is from Tom Watson, of course, from snuff-related media. Is this the same in the analogue film footage of The Devil of Christmas and later digital found footage style snuff aesthetics of the other seasonal Inside Number 9, the Deadline Halloween episode, for instance?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think it's quite interesting in terms of snuff films being kind of seen as the cinematic mode, even though they didn't have cinema runs, obviously. I mean, as far as we know, they don't exist, but the video nasties that they're kind of caught up in the mythology of were made for home reception, but they're still kind of associated with a film history rather than a television history. But I think in terms of the more contemporary engagements, they're definitely engaging more with genuine fatalities on television. So during Deadline, they show sort of clips, and one of them is of Bobby Davro having an accident on live television that could have killed him, and people have died on live television accidentally, and it draws on that, and they got his consent to use that clip. It wasn't used without permission, because obviously it's quite hard to find now, and rightly so. But there obviously have been lots of deaths connected with television in very direct ways, both in terms of those accidents and then in terms of reality television, especially after Steve Diamond's death in 2019 after going on the Jeremy Kyle show. There was lots of research about that, and I think that's something that they're very preoccupied with. So I suppose it's a combination of using the aesthetics of kind of the anxiety that we have around snuff films and the association with the 70s and the 80s, which connects quite nicely to some of the other papers, I think. And then a more contemporary concern about genuine deaths related to television broadcasting and especially reality TV. And I think it's quite interesting that Seance Time and Deadline were both grappling with that before the scandal came out around Jeremy Kyle. And that was when a lot of the research came out about how prevalent this issue was. But that's obviously something that they were preoccupied with before that, which I find interesting.
Yeah, God, Jeremy Kyle. Right, thank you. We're going to go to Dylan's question next, which is for everyone, but I'm going to throw it to Rich first. Do you perceive a tension within the analogue resurgence between the trends towards 1970s aesthetics and 1980s and later aesthetics? Do you think this has anything to do with a national and or generational divide in creators and consumers of this horror? So that's for everyone, but I'll chuck it to Rich first, if you don't mind.
So yeah, I do. And one of the ones that I think is most perceived and interesting at the moment is sort of the liminal horror that's emerging on sort of social media, which is sort of it's kind of like abandoned shopping malls and things like that. It seems to hold an appeal to kids from the 90s and to the 2000s. And I think what interests me about it is the idea that for them, especially if they're late 2000s, these sort of are the ephemera of Western culture that is collapsing. So for them, like a shopping mall is like a Gothic castle. And I find that sort of fascinating. And I think the sort of emergence of Skinamarink is sort of like an establishment of that new aesthetic and that new kind of haunted generation. The ghosts are different, but the experience, I think, is ultimately the same. And what the other thing I find fascinating about that is the connection of sort of the Gen Z liminal space horror with the digital as well. So it uses a lot of early Nintendo graphics or early Super Nintendo, PlayStation 1 graphics to sort of build these realistic sets, realistic worlds, but that are off in some way. I think there's something interesting there. And I definitely think that, certainly just from teaching in class, I don't think necessarily the things that scare me or interest me necessarily transfer to some of our younger students. Had a furious row the other day when somebody said RoboCop, the new RoboCop, or the newer RoboCop was better than the original. I almost had to be restrained.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, as depressing as it is for I'm going to say it, when kids today are saying stuff that's old school, and what a kid described something that I liked. I think I was talking about Resident Evil, and he described it as vintage, and I nearly punched him, which is fair enough. And so I throw this question over to Shellie next.
And I think with the stuff that I'm looking into, there is definitely maybe less so between 70s and 80s, kind of going back to those two decades. But I think that you're definitely starting to see now more of a going back to the very early 90s. So there was when me and Laura first started working around dead media stuff, there's a film called Rent-A-Pal that kind of threw up a problem for us. We were like, oh no, it's imitating the 90s, not the 80s. Have we kind of now gone into the period where we now have nostalgia, all these creators have nostalgia for that? I think what Rich said about the online stuff is really interesting, like the liminal spaces and stuff. And definitely I often get the feeling in classrooms that I'm now the crypt keeper that remembers the noise of dial-up internet. So yeah, I definitely think there is sort of a generational divide in creators and consumers that maybe we're seeing more and more.
Yeah, and it makes us feel very old. Brontë, anything to add to this question?
Mostly just to say I agree with what's already been said. I think things kind of go in cycles, don't they? And that people, when they come to the point of creating their own media, they're harking back to what they loved when they were younger, especially young filmmakers who are just starting out. I think you often can see a very clear influence of what they grew up with. And so it'll be interesting, I think, in another 20 years to see if people are still harking back to the 90s because they grew up with a recycling of 90s media, and if we just end up in this strange simulacrum of reference points getting further and further away. Though obviously media itself is also developing all the time, and there might be new reference points that we can't predict yet. I mean, I imagine a lot is going to be done with AI and that sort of branch of technology in terms of horror, but it is interesting to see those cycles and to see now, especially 90s kind of aesthetics coming back into fashion as people who grew up then are starting to make their own films and television. Yeah, it's really interesting.
It is. Brontë, back to you again, I'm afraid. It's all about you. So fascinating paper, says Kate. Kate was really interested in Pemberton and Shearsmith's commentary and their performance of debating about fan reception and arguing over this. Have they commented anywhere on this commentary and what they're trying to say through it about showrunner responses to fans, perhaps? Yeah,
they speak about this quite a lot, and they did an episode a couple of years ago called Simon Says, which is, I don't want to spoil it too much for anyone who hasn't seen it, but it's about a super fan of a television program who doesn't like the finale. This came out just after Game of Thrones, so make of that what you will, and decides to take matters into his own hands in increasingly horrific ways. And they've spoken quite a lot about certain levels of discomfort with certain kinds of fan engagement. And Reece Shearsmith quit Twitter briefly last year after some very strange behaviour from fans. But they've also talked a lot about identifying themselves as fans of particularly, older media, which they drew on themselves quite a lot. So I think it's a relationship that they're interested in, and a lot of their work is about the relationship between people producing media and the people consuming media, and not often in a straightforward sense, not in the sense of demonizing one or the other, but looking at how those relationships can become complicated, and how they can become damaging in kind of both directions. So I think it's kind of commentary, literal commentary, and the commentary in a philosophical sense on how both production and reception of media can get caught up in these ethical questions about what we owe to each other and the impact that we have on each other. If you haven't seen Simon Says, I recommend that to anyone who's interested in fan studies, particularly because that's a very interesting one.
Simon Says, just writing it down. There we go. All right, a question for Shellie from Dylan. Excuse me. What do you make of a modern trend in CGI special effects towards an increased focus on imitating practical texture, seen in, for example, Internet Analogue horror series or Twin Peaks series 3? Hang on, I can feel Lindsay Hallam's antenna twitching.
The ghost of Lindsay Hallam.
Yeah, well, if you say Twin Peaks 3 times, she appears.
Don't say her name in front of a mirror in the dark. I think it's really interesting because to me, like, I grew up in the 90s, and I was always like a little bit about digital effects. I was always a practical effects person. And I think it's interesting how, the kind of the move to digital effects was, partly as they got cheaper, it was more cost effective. but the kind of allure of them was the possibilities that you could have with digital effects that you just couldn't have with practical effects. And this idea, you know, they could be more lifelike, they could be more seamless, you wouldn't be able to kind of see the joins. And I think it's really interesting how recently digital effects are trying to manufacture the joins, so trying to put the imperfections back in so they look better. Or I think they look better. And I think a particularly interesting, I wanted to talk about it in this paper, but I ran out of time. Terrifier 2 is a really, you know, it's me and I'm talking about practical effects, so of course I'm going to talk about the Terrifier films because I'm obsessed with them. But they are, you know, they're held up as, oh, these are pinnacle of practical effects now, and like, you know, isn't it great that people are still doing this? But Terrifier 2 in particular uses kind of a combination, so it is very practical effect heavy, but there's certain parts in it that have sort of composite digital parts put in, because it's one of the only films that I've ever watched and gone, I don't understand how they did that certain scene purely practical effects, and then you find out, oh, actually it's digital as well. So I think that's really interesting as well, particularly in the horror genre, because there is this feeling in certain kind of circles that, you know, practical effects are here and digital effects are here, and they're kind of warring factions, whereas now we're seeing more and more them kind of going together.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, I don't want to jump in too much, but when I wrote about practical effects on TV, you know, they had to combine the two because of TV shooting schedules. It's like you've got 6 weeks and no more. So it's like, well, we haven't got time to make all these beautiful practical effects, and we know we're going to get shouted about it by fans, but you know, time's ticking, like what we're going to do. So Rich from Laura was thinking about Scavel's folk horror chain, and specifically the feature of beliefs, which can include tensions arising from clashes between the old and new, or a return to the old ways. Do you think we can suggest that analogue forms lend themselves to folk horror in this regard? Can we extend this idea beyond text to the production context that you're discussing?
Yeah, I think that's it's kind of an interesting question, because one of the things I discovered when I started writing this is that I think I was guilty myself of fetishizing film a little bit. You know, for me, I think it's too late. I will always see it as being better, and as a result, that's become one of the sort of challenges of my paper, is to sort of try and break down when I am basically taking a side essentially in something. But absolutely, I see that for the filmmakers who I've spoken to or watched interviews with, it actually seems a lot more methodical than that. It just does seem like what is practical for what we're doing and what are the finances and things. But I think for the audience in particular and the fans, that it is more of a old ways and new ways style battle. One sort of, I didn't really think it had a place in the paper, but someone who I saw as being very passionate about it and spoke really well about it was Quentin Tarantino, who talked about the feud he had with Robert Rodriguez on the set of Sin City, and that was the first time Quentin Tarantino had ever shot digitally, and he said he would never do it again. And he actually said specifically that the magic of film is innately linked to the projection process that happens between the celluloid and the light shining through it, which I thought was really interesting and is something that I deeply agree with. But again, that is probably just me being fetishistic about film. Can't help it.
I think that's what we're all here though for, right? All right then. So, Shellie, because you were cut off by the devil of technology, do you want to finish your answer to? Is it evident that these you know, practical effects makers in the films that we're talking about were regular Fangoria readers themselves as kids?
Yeah, to answer the question, there is, I don't know how much of my answer you heard because I think I was talking to myself for about a minute. But yeah, so Damien Leone, who's the director of the Terrifier films, he recently won Best Effects because he's also a special effects person at the Fangoria Awards, and his entire acceptance speech was, you know, I grew up reading this, I always wanted to be on the cover of it, and now I am. And a lot of them, Adam Green, for example, will often wear Fangoria t-shirts. I mean, how much of that is he actually read it as a kid, and how much of it is kind of like they have cool t-shirts now? I don't know how much that plays into it. Less so with British people, although I think because, you know, I know when I was growing up, Fangoria, it was quite hard to get hold of unless you went to a big bookstore or you went to somewhere like Forbidden Planet or something like that. And even then, it was up on the shelf with pornography, which is weird. Yeah, so less so on the British side, but definitely there is quite a lot of evidence on the American side of these people that are creating these films now were perhaps Fangoria readers back in the day.
Yeah, the link between horror and porn has been drawn before, hasn't it? Like, you know, that's a thing, and
it's
yeah.
like horror and porn, horror and metal, horror and wrestling.
Yeah, all the bad stuff.
All things I enjoy.
All the things that we want. One more question, or maybe some more questions, but at the moment I'm going down the list. From Laura for Shellie. Apparently it's phrased like utter shit, but let's see how we go. So given that Matthew's quote about adolescent 80s horror and the gendered implications around auteurism that maybe echo in the celebrations of Bottin and Savini, etc., is there something about Boys Club about effects and fandom discourse, and does the new icky sticky wave do anything to challenge this?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, the project that I'm doing at the minute, I was kind of struggling initially because all my kind of cultural reference points for practical effects are men, and I wanted to make sure I was including more than just white men. So I think more recently there's something that I'm working on at the moment. I'm working on a paper specifically about women in special effects, so sort of tracing things back to Millicent Patrick, who was the creator of The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which I think is one of the best kind of men in a suit designs ever. More recently, though, I've become really interested in, I cannot remember her name offhand, but there is a special effects makeup artist that does all the practical effects on stage for the band Ice Nine Kills, who do a lot of kind of like practical gore effects on stage. So she's a really interesting person. But you'll generally find when you look at films, like even The Thing, you know, there was a woman in the special effects team who did a lot of the miniatures and stuff like that. It's just, and partly I think due to Fangoria being that kind of sort of holding that the special effects, they literally say in one issue of it, you know, the special effects man as the new auteur, the new rock star, that because of that and because of things like Masters of Horror and stuff, I think horror generally is quite a kind of people tend to look at the horror genre as quite an auteurist kind of genre. Practical effects has been kind of put forward in these terms, so I think it's very difficult to kind of rewrite the histories that are already there. I mean, it's kind of our responsibility as academics to do that, but yeah, it's definitely a bit of a boys' club when you look back historically, but there are some really, really interesting women and people that aren't men working in special effects.
Yeah, well done everyone. Thank you panel so much. That was really interesting. Thank you so much.